On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, competition or cooperation? What does it take for innovation to go beyond geopolitical narratives? And waste imports. Why are some developing countries still doing it? Can China quit? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. There may be more than meets the eyes in the trade war between the United States and China. Some analysts believe that beneath the veil of a trade war, the U.S. is targeting China's future in innovation. A global ranking shows that Asian power is steadily climbing toward world leadership in innovation. And let's take a look at the current situation.
China is now among the top 20 most innovative countries in the world. The Global Innovation Index, a ranking produced by the World Intellectual Property Organization and its partners, placed China at 17th, up 5 notches from 2017. The U.S. was ranked 6th, down 2 positions from last year. The GII is based on international patent filings and scientific publishing activity. This is the first time that China finished in the GII's top 20. China is also the only upper middle income country in a ranking dominated by high-income European countries. According to the report, China was the main driver for a record increase in intellectual property filings in 2016. China came in at 29th when the index debuted in 2007. In recent years, however, China's investments have led to advances in artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, education technology, virtual reality, robotics, advanced manufacturing, and machine learning. On the other hand, the U.S. has lost its standing as a global leader in innovation based on the new index. In slightly more than a decade, America went from holding the top spot in 2007 to its current 6th spot, and it's often criticized for not having coherent national strategies for technology sectors.
For more discussion on the global driver of innovation, we invited into our studio Jay Huang, who is the founding partner of J-Stone Venture and the former managing director of Intel China. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Ernest McDuffie, the computer scientist and also founder of Global McDuffie Group. Meanwhile, last but not least, Troy Stangaroni, who is a senior director of Congressional Affairs and Trade at the Korea Economic Institute of America. He's also a former aide at Capitol Hill and the New Jersey governor. Welcome to our program, all of you gentlemen. I want to start with you, Jay. What exactly is this debate about, so-called China's innovation, what's behind it, and also whether China and the United States in ultimate competition? I wonder how this narrative is now shaping the directions of the two sides' interaction with one another.
I think up to now, I see on the China and the U.S. on the innovation side is more complementary to each other. I think China definitely made a lot of progress on innovation side of it, but all those innovations is based on comparative advantage. That means China take whatever is good for China and make progress off of that, and then the rest of them is rely on like a trade with U.S. and the world, etc. So all those are quite complementary to each other. I do not see direct competition necessarily up to this point.
But according to some, at least in Washington, quote-unquote, the Cold War has already started with China. Mr. McDuffie, if you take a look at some of the news going on these days, whether it's CIA or some of the other members of Congress, off the record, on the record, the Cold War phrase has been repeatedly used. Is it really, with that kind of mentality, is there any future about the two countries interacting with one another about science and technology?
Yeah, I think that there is. There has to be. The nature of science and technology is borderless. Advances are going to occur randomly around the world, and for countries that leadership positions like China and the U.S. to continue those leadership positions, they have to cooperate. They have to embrace the global nature of the advancement of science and technology. Otherwise, they'll become isolated and left in the dust.
Well, Mr. McDuffie, I mean, you probably is someone who has been experiencing the earlier Cold War, the one between the United States and the former Soviet Union. And you knew there were certain kinds of competitions which some still say the Cold War helped eventually with some of the biggest innovations. For example, shooting human beings onto the moon, or some of the latest development about the rocket technologies and many others. So many say it could be a driver of further innovation. Others say, actually, if you think about it, it's actually hindering the overall global development of real innovation. What would you say?
So the old Cold War model is really outdated. Certainly it did spur, as all wars do, they spur intense activities around technologies that advance the war effort for a particular nation, and that does have some benefits, but we've advanced technologically as a species to the point where actual warfare is unthinkable. You can't have a nuclear exchange between major parties and have the planet survive. So now we must come together as a species to fight those globally threatening issues like climate change and fresh water for people and all the other issues that are threatening everyone in order for the planet to survive.
But, you know, Ernest, I just don't know whether you are being earnest when you're expressing this, you know, beautiful dream of yours in a way. I'll come back to you a little bit because many of the politicians are talking very different phrases when they are describing innovation these days. Troy, let me go to you also. Since you're coming from a research background about the South Korea as well, you see the Bloomberg Index, for example, over the past several years has been labeling South Korea, Japan, China, these Asian countries and economies as on the very top of innovation index. That, of course, has a lot to do with the spending that these countries are using for innovation research, and also has a lot to do about how innovation and science and technology being used into the exact manufacturing and producing process. So, Troy, help us to understand what about this round of innovation, can they escape the old mentality of so-called Cold War?
So I think, first off, we often talk in these broad phrases like Cold War, but we need to probably step back. Things are much more complicated than that. If you look at something like the Bloomberg Index on Innovation, you know, we also need to put it in context. South Korea has led this metric for many years now, but if you also look at South Korean government policy, there's an understanding that they're actually trailing in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. And part of that's because, as you mentioned, some of this is based on process innovation. South Korea has been a leader and is very good at process innovation, but it's not necessarily good at basic innovation. Many of the patents it puts out, while it produces a large number, don't have the same value as patents by American companies, for example. So we need to look at this in a broader context of where countries have advantages, what these metrics really mean, and what it means for the future going forward in terms of how we can take and work together. For example, in the South Korean case, one of the areas where it falls down is much of its research is done only in South Korea. They are very weak when it comes to taking and looking at international cooperation on innovation.
Very interesting. We've been talking a lot these days in the media about the United States and China as if the innovative countries in the world are only United States and China. Actually, the picture is not like that. So let's just put on this case study about South Korea, for example, and share with our audience a little bit more information about that. South Korea is ranked one of the most innovative countries in the world. Science and technology have always been the pillars of its economy over the past 2 and 3 decades. It underwent rapid industrialization and maintained exceptionally high growth rates between the early 1960s and 1990s, gaining recognition as one of the 4 Asian dragons. That was the nickname being used then. By the early 21st century, it had developed into a high-income economy, becoming a world leader in manufacturing electronic components and devices. And by the way, we are not doing advertisement for any specific government or any specific country. But Mr. Huang, Jay here, this is a very interesting case study about how a developing country, when South Korea was back in the 1950s, and now become a country that is leading in innovation. Earlier, Troy talked about a different approach South Korea made, but I'm sure there are other examples, such as Japan, such as China, and some of the other Southeast Asian countries who are also working on innovation. So these very different models, it seems. Jay.
You're absolutely right. Take a semiconductor industry as example. In South Korea, and Samsung and other companies put a lot of money and research into the memory side of it. And then over the decade of effort, now Korea is the world #1 like memory producer in the world, very leading. Interestingly, if you look at what China has been doing right now, very similar as Korea government and industry has been doing probably a decade ago. And the interesting observation is, and the U.S. government and that didn't seem to raise any issue about Korea semiconductor industry development, but right now it doesn't seem to take a different standard towards China's and pursue semiconductor industry development. That was quite different and quite interesting.
Do you find it interesting, Ernest?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the comments that have been made they're certainly true. The issue, I think, of cooperation versus competition, and Cold War, trade wars, and all those things. I think these are political ramifications that I think political people in all countries would benefit from a better education in the sciences and engineering. The future of the world is going to depend on how we maintain and continue this advancement of technologies to support the infrastructures that we've already created. If the politicians don't understand the law of unintended consequences, we're heading for disaster. And this kind of chest thumping and Cold War status is completely counterproductive at this point.
But Ernest, I have to be earnest with you. In a way, it is policymakers that are making policies, and they are having a great impact on all communities, including the science and technology community. So we're not talking about something from another planet. We're talking about the politics that is going on right now. So having said that, though, Ernest, there's another issue. That is, what about technologies with its fast development? We see the human race, in a way, has to make a decision about what we want the technologies to do. For example, the recent case is about Elon Musk and DeepMind. They have committed to the rest of the world not to produce so-called automatic weapons, meaning not to produce robots that would likely to make the decision of taking away people's lives. And they decide it has to be a decision made by a human being, and it is not going to be right if it is the other way around. But Ernest, they committed does not mean the others would commit it. And when a quote-unquote Cold War mentality gets spread around, that will be taken advantage of by very different forces in our world. And things are likely to go much more dangerous than just a nuclear war, as you just mentioned. Ernest.
Yeah, you're absolutely, but I think the point is that these policymakers, if they're not informed, if they don't understand the nature of this technology and the science that they're making policies about, the odds of them making good policy goes down dramatically. I'm advocating that there needs to be more education among the policymakers, among the politicians, as to the reality of what the technology can and can't do in order for them to make better policy.
Troy, do you agree with that? Will policymakers be able to decide the fate of directions of science and technology? How are we going to be not limited by their narrative?
Well, I think the challenge is yes, Ernest is right. Policymakers have to have good information to make good policy, but they're also under different constraints. And those constraints relate to the specific interests of either their district, if they're a member of Congress, or their state. And so how is job creation going? What are the challenges being faced by innovation within the United States? And so if there are barriers around the world or things that are impacting back home, you're going to see different policies than if you have a much more open environment. And I think one of the things that we often sort of miss is that, you know, this debate you're having right now between the United States and China is one, it's not simply about who is going to lead innovation, but it's also about how open markets will be. And one of the complaints that the U.S. has had is that the Chinese market has not been as open as the U.S. market. Now, President Trump is clearly using tools of protectionism to try and reverse that, but this is another side of the debate that we need to keep an eye on. And it's going to be a challenge in China, too, because as China moves up the production ladder, we're going to see people in industry in China lose jobs, and China will face pressure to create jobs as well, like the United States.
Jay, that is an extremely interesting and important question. What Troy seemed to be talking about is a question about who should be the players when it comes to development of innovation and science, and who should be the players that are really making the decisions. How would different players, different factors come into the overall negotiation process and come out with some of the best ways to do things? Jay, what do you think?
I think we're living quite a different or unprecedented era compared to the previous Cold War. In the old Cold War era, Soviet Union and the United States economies, they're quite separate. Now the China and the U.S. economy are so interdependent to each other. So I don't know and how, you know, both countries how to engage this Cold War by two economies are so interdependent to each other. I think the best way, and for both countries and also for world economy, is you know, each side open up the market, and I agree with that. And the guests and China should do more to open up our market to the world and to the United States, and then each country doing based on comparative and advantage, and then make their own you know, development on the area they can be better, and also trade with the rest of the world in the area which they are not as good as the others. I think that should be the you know, free trade, and also every country based on the comparative advantage to develop their own economy.
Talking about the comparative advantage, Jay, I do want to ask further about that. Certainly China, the size of the market is one of its biggest advantages. But also these days, when it comes to the size, when it comes to the number, there's an important thing that is data. The number of people that you have, the size of the market that you have, means you have an enormous source of data, which is uncomparable in the world. So how countries and economies realize about that and cooperate on top of that foundation is also an interesting topic, isn't it?
Absolutely right. I think it touched very fundamental about the complementary nature of China and the United States. United States have you know, a lot of advantage and technologies. China has a huge market, and then going to the artificial intelligence, and U.S. is leading on the algorithm and also the chips, and China also have a huge data, and then the engineers, U.S. and China engineers, can play with it. So by nature, these two nations are already, you know, interdependent to each other.
Well, all the three of you, I understand well, it seems that all the three of you are almost on the same line. But the reality and the rhetoric we see in the media, and some of the hearings you see on the Capitol Hill, and some of the debates in the chat room are totally going the other direction. So is there a disconnect, ladies and gentlemen, about what we are discussing today? That is, what the scientists are thinking and what the so-called politicians and politics are thinking. And eventually, how do you see this competition of rhetorics? Whether it's coming eventually from the science community, or is it eventually coming from the political community from different countries? I want to have your views here, and what would make things change. Let's go to you, Ernest, first.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Those two separate communities certainly have different functions in our society. You know, there's a saying that all politics are local, And so, you're going to have this tendency of politicians to want to do things that are good for their constituency, their own country. But science and technology is universal. Those are the understanding of that and how it's going to affect each other is these interconnected
But how can you influence them?
in.
How can you influence them, Ernest? We are saying here, probably they don't want to hear. But how can you influence them and be able to let them realize what you have realized through years of practices? That's the question.
Well, yeah, in the United States, the only way to influence the political body is at the ballot box. You have to vote intelligent people with proper training and education background into positions where they can affect policy. If you continue to elect people that don't know how to spell technology and science, you're going to have problems. So, and that speaks for the world. As we put whatever influence as individuals we have to affect our leaders, we have to apply that in the most intelligent way possible. This cult of personality is of no value to anyone.
All right. Choi, can that be done? Short term?
I think the challenge here really comes down to this disconnect between the way market forces work and the way politicians would like to see job creation work. And until you go through this process and there's this realization that the tools we're using, these tariffs on imports and things, aren't going to actually create the impact we want, and that we need to address deeper fundamental challenges in the U.S. economy, I think you're going to have this tension. And so I'm not sure that it's a question of how intelligent our politicians are, because we have some who are actually quite intelligent, but I do think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding on the economic forces at play. And so I think we need to do a better job of explaining that to people and also explaining why that can help job creation if we take advantage of those forces better.
Will that be too little too late, Jay, under the current geopolitical situations?
Despite of the
Jay?
Despite of the complementary and interdependent nature of these two countries, and I think unfortunately these two countries are heading collision course. I'm quite pessimistic for short-term outcome, and I think I don't know when and things can be better in short term.
Well, before we go, let me ask the three of you, since you're all having science background and innovation background, what will be the factors, or rather the sectors, that you are going to watch very closely as scientists, as someone who works with innovation on a daily basis? Choi?
Well, I'm really looking sort of at how the Trump administration pursues this. Do they continue these national security investigations and things like semiconductors and other high-tech areas, or do they start focusing more on sort of traditional areas like steel? If they start moving into the high-tech areas, I think we're in for a more difficult challenge.
All right. Let's go to Ernest.
So the areas I think that are going to be most impactful moving forward: nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. The intersection of those three areas are going to be game changers across the globe and across every discipline that we depend on today. So that theoretical knowledge that's coming out of universities around the globe has to be paid attention to, because that's where it's going to come from.
Jay, last but not least.
I think in my area, the semiconductor and development in China, we see a lot of bright future, a lot of investment opportunities are currently in China. So I'm quite happy and also quite focused on this area, despite of those geopolitical and maybe a nonsense and tensions, and we just forget about those and focus on what we're doing daily.
That's what scientists would do, right? Anyway, thank you so much for the three of you, Jay Huang and Choi Stagaroni and Ernest McDuffie. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Why are some developing countries still receiving waste imports? Can China quit that practice? We'll talk about that right after this break. You're watching World Insight, and I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. For decades, China, among other developing economies, has been a major importer of plastic waste. But after banning all scrap plastic imports earlier this spring, waste exporters have shifted away from China into Southeast Asia. But the question is why people did that from the very beginning, to import waste. This change has made countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand also imported brunt of international waste, doubling or even tripling their imports of scrap plastic in recent months. In response, Thailand placed a prohibition and possibly an indefinite ban on these imports, following Vietnam and other Southeast Asian neighbors. The issue of waste and environmental protection has always been a big concern for developing countries, China included. For more about China's ban on waste imports, we are joined in Beijing, Wu Changhua, Director of the Professional Association for China Environment, or PACE. Welcome, ma'am, to our program.
Thank you.
People wonder why would the developing countries, China included, such a big one, import waste and plastic waste?
Historically, there was an obvious reason. So a few decades ago, in 1990s, early 1990s, when China really started to faster industrialization, and we needed materials. And back then, actually, the material industry in China was not very well developed, and there's also cost issue. So somehow importing those wastes coming to China becomes something valuable. So that literally created a market. And
but that was at the very beginning, and then things went very different direction.
Well, no, that lasted for about 2 decades, honestly. And even though China had laws, regulations about solid waste management, including importing solid waste, but somehow, if you look at the numbers between 1996 and 2016, actually, and the number 10 times higher. So there was a great, huge market there. Then, of course, as the industrialization continued and China got to a certain level of development, and if you look at the materials, actually, we have a much stronger material industry. And the environmental side, I think the laws, regulations, awareness becoming much, much stronger in this country. So there was much limited, actually, loophole for waste like that. One major challenge in the importing process is that we didn't really pay enough attention to environmental hazard and health hazard. I think that caused a major challenge to the country, and that's a weakening call, and we are trying to deal with that.
That is one thing. The other thing is about the country that is exporting those wastes to the other countries, particularly to the developing economies. One is ethical issue. The other is about the development issue. That is, what roles different countries are likely to play in the overall global development.
Absolutely.
What do you make of that?
I think, Western countries over the decades have been sort of championing the environmental agenda globally, right? If you look at the environmental governance. But there were certain areas, hidden areas, not paid enough attention, particularly on the waste issues there. And the domestic laws regulations literally created very little space for them for landfill. There was not much, actually, space for landfill anymore. And the cost, actually, to handle the waste becomes so high. So then they need to find a way out, and exporting those trash, actually garbage, to developing countries somehow became the solution. And in that process, not many people paid attention about the ethics, about the impact, environmental impact and health impact to developing countries. And somehow, I think we just sort of actually let it out there, for a while. But now I think in the recent decades, there's overall general awakening to the environmental health impact there. I think now it's a time to really put this on the table and trying to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah. After understanding the China story, let's take a look at the world globally. So may we also invite 2 other guests. One is Isabel Hilton, who is the CEO and editor of ChinaDialogue.net. That is a website that is focusing on environmental issues around the world, particularly the issue of China. In Washington, D.C., we also invited Michael Dorsey, who is a member of Club of Rome, who's also the co-founding director of the Center for Environmental Health. I want to welcome the other 2 guests as well, Isabel and Michael. Thank you so much for coming over to our show. Can things change, Isabel, change dramatically when it comes to the so-called dumping of waste into developing countries, when it comes to, quote-unquote, the, how shall I say, the way of developing countries try to produce their raw materials?
I think things certainly can change, but I think that the existence of the China market, particularly for plastics, and China was taking about half the world's plastics until very recently, kind of let developed countries off the hook, because consumers thought that plastics were being recycled. It was, as we've heard, being shipped to China. It was also being shipped often in a very poor way, so contaminated, not properly sorted. And if you look across the whole chain of production of plastics to the consumption to the recycling, you can see problems in every part of this chain. But I think things can certainly change, and I think the China ban has brought home to developed countries that how much they need to change.
Right.
The problem is not that we don't have the capacity, it's that the organization of everything from what kind of plastics are produced, how they were used, how they're designed, and how they're then collected requires, it requires a structure. It's not so much a technical issue as an issue of policy and organization and incentive.
Okay, Michael, what about that? Can things be done in a short-term matter? Because after all, these wastes are being produced every day. And after all, they have to be, in a way, dealt with in the developed economies, let's just say.
Absolutely. Now is the moment to begin to, I think, step even further than China has and to talk about a global conversation on the need to ban the trade in waste, and certainly in plastic waste, PVCs in particular. This is a critical moment. China, I think, is sending a signal to the world of what needs to happen. The United States Environmental Protection Agency, for example, has studied the issue of what they call environmental racism. That's the dumping of toxics and hazardous material on poor communities in this country, but they also look at that issue globally. And so we know over the past generation the policies of the United States have really largely been based in an ethos of environmental racism, pushing the dirty waste around the world to those lesser economies in the world, not just China, but in South Asia and so forth, particularly in Africa. That's a problem that's got to stop. I think the challenge going forward, though, is not just banning things like PVC and plastics and so forth, but really moving a conversation to redesign products. That's a conversation that we haven't had much global leadership on. We need some of that. Moving a conversation to get out of the short-termism. There was certainly some economic value that China received for dealing in those waste over the years, but that was really marginal. We've got less than 10% of recycling goes on in the waste stream system. It's really, really low.
Right.
It's not that valuable at all. It's a good step for China to ban something bad as opposed to doing things like banning people.
But here's the challenge. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, you understand this much better than I do. That is, climate change, environmental protection has been a key issue the world embraces over the past 1 decade, let's just say. But of course, the geopolitical changes, new leadership in some countries has, in a way, pushed against the global trend of deal with it. And now things seem to be in a very different light. So, Michael, you're coming from one of those countries that are facing this kind of challenge. The question is, can it be done? I want to throw it back to you under the very different light.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that it's not just a single country issue. It's certainly not just a U.S. problem or a Chinese problem. It's truly a global problem, and there is an upside to this particular problem. There is a multi-billion-dollar industry in packaging, and we can imagine a multi-billion-dollar industry in the rethinking of packaging. It might even be a higher upside than that. So there's an opportunity here when we think about what comes after banning the waste trade, banning the movement of waste and hazardous materials, plastic and other sorts of things. There's an upside to this, and that's really in the redesign. That's also in the short term. That's in the management of plastic waste. That's in the management of waste overall.
Right, that's been
mentioned. There's a very low-end global conversation there.
But Isabel, structural reforms, that's what Michael seems to be suggesting, underlining his answer. That is not easy for a lot of governments to do. And politics are being used in order to delay that process, as you may know as well. So the question I want to go to you as well about whether it can be done and it will be done efficiently, or rather there will be more zigzagging in rhetorics, not actions.
I think I'm afraid we live in a world where zigzagging and rhetoric are rather on the rise. But certainly, if you look at the situation in Europe, there's a high degree of consciousness about this. And the China ban, I would hope, would actually lead to countries in Europe producing better policy rather than simply looking for cheaper markets or existing markets to dump. We see the knock-on effect of the China ban where it goes to much smaller countries which very rapidly find they can't cope. So I think we've had a sort of two-stage let the market sort it out, and the market clearly can't sort it out, and we're going to have to come back to policy, and we are going to have to look at the complete supply chain and redesign it so that recycling is real and not just an illusion.
Changhua,
but I think it can certainly be done.
Yeah. Changhua, you know, there's a tendency of kicking the can down the road, right? You just delay all the hard work and put it into a political framework as if that is the issue. So, Changhua, what do you make of that? Can developing countries here play a role besides banning it and also lead the process of structural reform?
The short answer is yes, but I would probably take one step back, look at the overall picture.
Go ahead.
I think the China ban definitely has triggered a global revolution, or accelerating solutions. Laws, regulations are being put in place, if you like, Australia, US, and Europe, Japan, among others. So there's a very positive impact, you know, when China issued the ban. From the market perspective, and it's very exciting to see, you know, like Apple, you know, leadership companies like Apple, Alibaba's Cainiao, JD.com, among others, they all come on board actually committing to, for instance, Apple's closed loop and Cainiao's commitment with a sort of a green, smart logistic city sort of model, restructuring not only the product design itself, but also the recycling, the material flow system there. And in that process, to integrate the digital technology and like blockchain and AI, among others. So I think I feel very confident, actually. I think things are coming together, and particularly because of ban from China, and we are witnessing a much accelerated, actually, solution.
Having said that, though, what would be some of the specific factors that all of you as experts in the field would concentrate on to see about the speed and efficiency of the change, and also as the critical areas for change? Isabel, briefly from you first.
Well, first of all, we need much stricter regulation on what type of plastic is produced and in package design, because a lot of consumer items at the moment, they are combined with other materials, and that makes them unrecyclable. Secondly, we need to look at chemical recycling rather than physical recycling, because physical recycling degrades after 2 or 3 generations, and then it ends up in the ocean. And thirdly, we need to look at what, certainly in terms of ocean pollution, what are the really big problems? We have a lot of gesture politics going on at the moment, like companies banning plastic straws. That's a tiny, tiny part of ocean pollution. It's important for consumer education, but for example, the biggest source of ocean plastics is discarded fishing tackle. Now, how do you tackle that? So let's take a scientific and a rational approach. You know, certainly the consumer is an important part in giving political permission for good policy. Consumer plastics are not in themselves the huge problem.
Changhua, your answer?
I would probably, at this moment in China in particular, focusing on the e-commerce landscape. Because, you know, many consumers are now connected with the e-commerce, and that's the entry point, intervention point where you can get individual consumers to be actively engaged to change the behavior, starting with the families, right? Garbage sorting, make sure they put different waste actually into different bins and put them in the right place. And in the meantime, of course, reducing the waste and recycle, reuse, you know, I think all these 5 R's actually need to be put in place. I definitely see e-commerce as the biggest opportunity.
Michael, last but not least.
You know, I think we're going to see 3 things coming forward. It's going to be about prices, it's going to be about power, it's going to be about politics. And we saw that in this ban. I think the power of China to say we're going to ban this is really catalyzing action around the world. There's an upside in terms of the economics of this, in terms of redesigning packaging. And then we're going to have to go through a political process. Some of that's playing out in the multilateral level. Some of that's playing out in states where they're having this conversation, for example, in the US and California, thinking about bans and so forth going forward. So it's about power, politics, and prices.
All right. Michael Dorsey, Isabel Hilton, last but not least, Wu Changhua. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.